Somewhere between 15,000 and 40,000 years ago, on a frozen steppe that would one day become Central Europe, a wolf stepped closer to a human campfire than any wolf had ever stepped before. It did not attack, it did not flee, it stayed. What happened in the hours, days, and generations that followed produced the oldest partnership between two species on Earth. Today, there are roughly 500 million domestic dogs alive on the planet, more than 4 times the population of Japan, spread across every continent humans have touched, sleeping in beds, guarding livestock, detecting explosives, guiding the blind through city streets. No other animal has embedded itself so completely in human civilization. No other animal even comes close. What nobody knew until molecular geneticists and archaeologists began pulling the evidence apart over the last 25 years was that the textbook version of wolf domestication, the version involving brave hunters stealing wolf pups from dens and raising them by firelight, may have the entire relationship backwards. The traditional version goes like this. Early humans, sometime during the last ice age, discovered wolf dens along the edges of glacial valleys and boreal forests. They took the pups. They raised the tamest ones near the campfire. They bred those tame ones together. Over hundreds of generations, the wolf became the dog. Humans were the active agents. Wolves were the passive subjects. We chose them. We engineered them. We turned a wild predator into man's best friend through deliberate effort and patient selection. This story has a clean logic to it. It puts humans in control. It frames domestication as a deliberate act of biological engineering, no different from breeding cattle for milk production or cultivating wild emmer wheat into something that grows in neat rows. And for roughly a century, the pup theft model was essentially unchallenged in zoology textbooks and natural history documentaries. The problems with it are enormous. Start with the practical reality of stealing a wolf pup from a den occupied by its mother and the rest of the pack. Gray wolves during the Pleistocene were not the diminished, fragmented populations of modern Yellowstone or the forests of Poland. They were apex predators at the peak of their evolutionary range, 40 to 70 kilograms of muscle and jaw pressure, operating in coordinated packs across some of the harshest terrain the planet has produced. An adult female gray wolf defending a den is one of the most dangerous animals a Paleolithic hunter could encounter. The pack does not scatter when you approach the den. The pack attacks. The idea that early humans were routinely raiding wolf dens, snatching pups, and somehow surviving the experience without losing hunters in the process assumes a casualty rate that no small nomadic band, surviving on thin caloric margins during an Ice Age winter, could absorb. Then there is the behavioral problem. Anyone who has worked with wolves in captivity, at facilities like the Wolf Science Center in Ernstbrunn, Austria, or the Wildlife Science Center in Minnesota, knows that socialization of a wolf pup to humans requires constant, intensive, physical contact, beginning within the first 2 to 3 weeks of life. After that critical developmental window closes, the wolf becomes increasingly fearful of humans, and eventually unmanageable regardless of how much contact it receives. A Paleolithic hunter carrying a blind 2-week-old wolf pup back to camp across frozen ground would need to bottle feed it, keep it warm against its body, and maintain near-continuous physical contact for weeks, all while managing the demands of survival in an environment where missing a single hunt could mean starvation. And even if a band somehow managed to raise a wolf pup successfully to adulthood, the animal would remain a wolf, not a dog. A tame wolf is not a domestic dog. The behavioral and physiological differences between the two are not matters of degree. They are matters of kind, written into the genome itself, the product of thousands of years of accumulated selection pressures that cannot be replicated in a single generation or even 10. A tame wolf will still challenge you for dominance. A tame wolf will still attempt to leave during breeding season. A tame wolf will not look at your face for guidance the way a Labrador Retriever does, without being taught. If you are watching this and wondering how a theory with this many holes survived in the scientific literature for as long as it did, you are asking exactly the right question. Subscribe to this channel because the answer involves a Soviet geneticist working in a frozen research institute in Siberia, a a cave full of 36,000-year-old skulls in Belgium, and a genetic mutation linked to a human syndrome that makes people compulsively friendly to strangers. And none of those things are what you expect. It was 1959, and a geneticist named Dmitry Belyaev was about to launch an experiment that would take more than half a century to produce its full results. Belyaev worked at the Institute of Cytology and Genetics in Novosibirsk, deep in Soviet Siberia, a city built on the banks of the Ob River where winter temperatures routinely drop below -30 degrees Celsius. He had a theory that put him at odds with the prevailing wisdom. He believed that domestication was not primarily about humans actively selecting animals for specific useful traits like size, strength, herding instinct, or obedience. He believed domestication was driven by a single upstream variable, one that sat above all the others in the developmental hierarchy: tameness. His reasoning was elegant. If you take a wild animal population and selectively breed only the individuals that show the least fear and the least aggression toward humans, the physical and behavioral traits that we associate with domestication, floppy ears, curled tails, piebald coats, juvenile facial proportions, shortened snouts, reduced tooth size, would emerge on their own as a downstream byproduct, not because anyone selected for them, because the genes that control fear and aggression are linked, through shared developmental and hormonal pathways, to the genes that control those physical traits. To test this, Belyaev chose silver foxes. Wild silver foxes were sourced from a commercial fur farm in Estonia and transported to the research facility in Novosibirsk. Each generation, the research team evaluated every kit for its behavioral response to a human hand extended into its enclosure. Only the tamest individuals, the foxes that showed the least fear, the least tendency to bite, and the most willingness to approach, were selected for breeding. No other trait was considered. Not coat color, not body size, not anything except the animal's willingness to tolerate a human being. The results arrived faster than anyone predicted. By the fourth generation, less than 4 years into the experiment, some fox pups were approaching handlers voluntarily, instead of cowering at the back of the cage. By the sixth generation, a small percentage were actively seeking human contact, wagging their tails in rapid lateral sweeps, licking the researchers' hands and faces, whimpering for attention when the scientists walked past their enclosures. By generation 10 to 15, roughly a decade and a half into the project, physical changes started appearing that nobody had selected for. Ears that flopped forward instead of standing erect, tails that curled upward over the spine, coats that broke out in irregular white patches and spots, disrupting the uniform silver fur, skulls that shortened and widened, producing rounder, more puppy-like facial proportions, reproductive cycles that shifted, with some females coming into heat twice a year instead of once, breaking the strict seasonal breeding pattern of their wild ancestors. Belyaev had produced, in roughly 15 years and 15 generations, a behaviorally domesticated animal, not through millennia of gradual change, not through deliberate engineering of physical characteristics, through the relentless selection of a single behavioral trait, tameness. And the physical transformation came along for the ride, uninvited but inevitable. This decision, pick the friendliest fox and breed it with another friendly fox and repeat, seemed small at the time. It was not. The cascade it triggered reshaped the entire organism from the inside out. The friendly foxes produced significantly more serotonin and significantly less cortisol and adrenaline than their wild counterparts. Their adrenal glands were physically smaller. Their stress responses were muted, slower to activate, and quicker to resolve. And the physical changes, the floppy ears, the spotted coats, the shortened muzzles, the curled tails, were all downstream consequences of altered developmental timing. The hormonal shifts caused by reduced stress responses changed when and how certain embryonic cell populations, particularly neural crest cells, migrated through the developing body. The same cells that contribute to adrenal gland development also contribute to ear cartilage, fur pigmentation, and craniofacial structure. Change the hormones, and you change everything those cells build. Belyaev died in 1985, before the experiment reached its full maturity, but his colleague Lyudmila Trut continued the work at the same institute in Novosibirsk, maintaining the breeding lines with meticulous care for decades after his death. By the time Trout published her landmark review article in the journal American Scientist in 1999, the fox population had been under continuous selection for tameness across 40 generations. The domesticated foxes were, for all behavioral purposes, dog-like animals in a fox body. They followed handlers around the facility. They responded to their names. They sought eye contact with humans. Some of them could read human pointing gestures, looking where a person pointed to find hidden food, a cognitive ability that wolves cannot perform reliably but that dogs accomplish as puppies without any training. Think about what that means for a second. Belyaev did not set out to create dogs. He set out to test a theory about the mechanism underlying domestication. And in doing so, he demonstrated something that shattered the pup theft model entirely. You do not need a human deliberately choosing which wolves to keep and which to cast out. You do not need anyone with a plan. You just need an environment that creates a selection pressure favoring tameness. If that pressure exists naturally, domestication happens on its own, without a single deliberate decision by any human being. And 30,000 years ago, on the frozen margins of Paleolithic hunting camps scattered across Ice Age Europe and Central Asia, that selection pressure existed in abundance. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. In 2001, Raymond Coppinger, a biologist at Hampshire College in Amherst, Massachusetts, published a book that reframed the entire domestication question from the ground up. Coppinger had spent decades studying working dogs and village dogs around the world, from the livestock guardian breeds of Turkey to the free-ranging scavenger dogs of Mexican towns. His proposal, which he called the dump heap hypothesis, was blunt in its simplicity. Early human settlements produced waste. Food scraps, cracked marrow bones, discarded carcasses, spoiled plant material, all of it concentrated in heaps at the edges of camps. For a scavenging wolf, those dump heaps represented a reliable caloric resource that required far less energy to exploit than tracking and running down live prey across a frozen Pleistocene landscape where temperatures could plunge to -40 degrees. The wolves that could tolerate being near humans, the ones whose flight distance was slightly shorter than average, whose fear response triggered at 10 meters instead of 30, whose adrenaline spike took a fraction of a second longer to fire, those wolves gained access to the dump heap calories. The wolves that could not tolerate human proximity bolted into the forest at the first sign of movement and continued hunting the hard way. Over hundreds of generations, the wolves that lingered near the dumps bred preferentially with each other, concentrating the genes for reduced fearfulness in a subpopulation that was gradually diverging from the wider wolf gene pool. The dump heap itself became the selection pressure. No human needed to steal a pup. No hunter needed to risk a den raid. The wolves domesticated themselves. Coppinger's model solved every practical problem that the traditional theft narrative could not explain. It accounted for how domestication could proceed without intentional human planning. It explained why the process could unfold gradually across centuries without requiring any single human decision-maker or master breeder. And it aligned perfectly with Belyaev's experimental data from Novosibirsk. Selection for tameness, whether imposed by a Soviet researcher in a laboratory or imposed by a pile of mammoth bones outside a Paleolithic tent, produces the same biological outcome through the same hormonal and developmental pathways. If this deep dive into the origins of the animal sleeping on your couch is keeping you watching, drop a comment telling me which part of the story has surprised you most so far. The archaeological evidence coming next is even stranger than the genetics, and the comment section on this channel is one of the best places on this platform for actual scientific conversation. Brian Hare, a professor of evolutionary anthropology at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina, took Coppinger's self-domestication model further by adding a cognitive dimension. Hare specialized in comparative animal cognition, specifically the question of what domestic dogs understand about human social behavior that other animals, including our closest primate relatives, do not. His research, published across multiple peer-reviewed papers and synthesized in his 2013 book, demonstrated that dogs possess a unique and apparently innate ability to read human communicative cues. They follow pointing gestures. They interpret the direction of human eye gaze. They respond to facial expressions. They track the attention state of the person in the room, adjusting their behavior depending on whether the human is watching or not. Wolves raised by humans from birth, with every advantage of early socialization, cannot reliably do any of this. Even chimpanzees, our closest living relatives sharing roughly 98.7% of our DNA, struggle with tasks that a 10-week-old puppy performs without hesitation. Point at a cup hiding a treat, and a puppy looks at the cup. A chimpanzee looks at your finger. Hare proposed that this remarkable social cognition was not something humans deliberately bred into dogs through generations of careful selection. It was yet another byproduct of the same process Belyaev had documented in his foxes. As the proto-dogs at the edge of Paleolithic camps became less fearful of humans, they became more attentive to human behavior. They had to. The individuals who could read the camp's rhythms most accurately, who could predict when food would be discarded, who could interpret a hunter's posture or a child's gesture, gained a survival advantage over proto-dogs that could not. They got more food, they avoided more danger, they were tolerated more, and they passed that social intelligence to their offspring. Hare called it the self-domestication hypothesis. The wolves that became dogs were not captured, trained, or engineered by human breeders. They chose a niche. They chose to live at the boundary between the wild and the human world. And the selective pressures of that niche reshaped them, generation by generation, into something that had never existed before. For a while, the scientific picture looked settled. The self-domestication model explained the behavioral transformation. Belyaev's foxes explained the biological mechanism. Coppinger's dump heaps explained the ecological context. The story was elegant, parsimonious, and satisfying. That did not last. In 2009, paleontologist Mieke Germain-Pré at the Royal Belgian Institute of Natural Sciences in Brussels published a study in the Journal of Archaeological Science that upended the entire timeline. Germain-Pré had been systematically re-examining canid skulls from Goyer Cave, a limestone cavern carved into the Meuse River basin in southern Belgium. The cave had been excavated decades earlier, and its thousands of bones warehoused in museum collections, where many had never been studied with modern methods. Among those bones, Germain-Pré identified a canid skull that was morphologically distinct from any known Pleistocene wolf. The skull was shorter, from front to back. The snout was proportionally wider. The teeth were smaller relative to body size. The overall cranial shape fell outside the range of variation documented in European wolves from the same period. And it was 36,000 years old. 36,000 years. The commonly accepted window for dog domestication at that time was 15,000 to 17,000 years ago. Germain-Pré's Goyer skull pushed the earliest possible evidence of a dog-like canid back by roughly 19,000 years. That gap is further back than the founding of every empire, every organized religion, and every written language currently in use on Earth. The entire span of recorded human history, from the first cuneiform tablets pressed into wet clay in Mesopotamia to the phone in your pocket, fits inside it nearly 4 times. The claim was immediately and fiercely controversial. Robert Wayne, a renowned evolutionary biologist at the University of California, Los Angeles, who had spent decades studying canid genetics, argued that the Goyer specimen could represent an unusual wolf variant, rather than a proto-dog. Morphology alone, Wayne cautioned, was not sufficient to distinguish the earliest dogs from contemporary wolves, because at that stage of divergence, the two populations had not yet separated far enough for skeletal differences to be definitive. A wolf with an unusually short snout is still a wolf. Germain-Pré pushed back with additional evidence. At Predmosty, an open-air archaeological site in the Moravian region of the Czech Republic, dating to approximately 27,000 years ago, she identified more canid skulls with dog-like cranial proportions. Some of these skulls had been found with large mammoth bones carefully positioned inside their mouths, suggesting deliberate placement during burial. If these animals were ordinary wolves, why were Paleolithic humans interring them with what appeared to be ritual care? If they were proto-dogs, the domestication timeline was at least twice as long as anyone in the scientific mainstream had been willing to accept. If you have made it this far into the story, you are not a casual viewer. You are the kind of person who actually wants to understand the deep science behind the world around you. Subscribe now, because the genetic evidence that came next changed everything, and the algorithm will stop recommending this channel if you do not signal that you want to see more. The timing of what happened next in the molecular biology laboratories was almost too perfect to be coincidental. In 2013, Olaf Thälmann, A geneticist at the University of Turku in Finland published a landmark study in the journal Science that brought ancient DNA into the domestication debate with full force. Thalmann's team extracted and sequenced mitochondrial DNA from 18 ancient canid specimens held in museum collections across Europe, including genetic material from the controversial Goyet cave skull. They compared these ancient sequences against DNA from 49 modern wolves, sampled from populations spanning the Northern Hemisphere, and 77 modern dogs representing a wide range of breeds. The results were striking. The phylogenetic analysis suggested that all modern dogs trace their maternal ancestry to a population of ancient European wolves, not to East Asian or Middle Eastern wolf populations, as several previous studies had proposed. The molecular clock estimates placed the divergence between dogs and wolves somewhere between 18,800 and 32,100 years ago, far earlier than the 15,000-year consensus. The European origin caught the field off guard. Earlier genetic work had pointed to East Asia or the Fertile Crescent as the likely cradle of domestication. Thalmann's data shifted the geographic center of gravity thousands of kilometers to the northwest, into the frozen landscapes of Pleistocene Europe during the last glacial maximum, the coldest interval of the most recent ice age, when massive ice sheets covered Scandinavia and northern Britain and human populations were small, scattered, and clinging to survival and refugia south of the glacial front. 2 years later, in 2015, Pontus Skoglund at the Francis Crick Institute in London pushed the molecular clock estimates back even further. Skoglund's analysis of ancient dog genomes from both European and Asian contexts suggested that the split between the dog lineage and the wolf lineage may have occurred as early as 27,000 to 40,000 years ago. If those dates are correct, the origins of dog domestication sit squarely in the world of Paleolithic big game hunters, long before the appearance of settled villages, grain storage, agricultural surplus, or anything resembling the semi-permanent dump heaps that Coppinger's self-domestication model required. This created a serious problem for the elegant narrative that had been building. The dump heap hypothesis depended on sustained human occupation of fixed or semi-fixed locations, producing reliable concentrations of food waste that could attract scavenging wolves over many consecutive generations. But 35,000 years ago, humans did not live in semi-permanent settlements. They were highly mobile nomadic hunters following the seasonal migrations of mammoth herds, reindeer, bison, and horses across vast open tundra steppe landscapes. Their camps were temporary, occupied for days or weeks, then abandoned as the herds moved on. There were no permanent refuse heaps. There were temporary scatters of bone and offal, quickly consumed by scavengers and dispersed by weather. If domestication began that early, it could not have followed the Coppinger model as originally described. Something else was drawing wolves and humans together, something that worked in the context of highly mobile hunter-gatherer life rather than settled village existence. Pay attention to what comes next, because it explains everything that the genetic and archaeological evidence alone cannot. While the geneticists were fighting over timelines and geographic origins in their laboratories, the archaeologists had been quietly assembling a body of evidence that neither camp had fully reckoned with. Evidence of a relationship between humans and canids that was not merely practical, not merely economic, not merely a matter of shared caloric interest. Emotional. In 1914, workers quarrying basalt near the village of Oberkassel on the western bank of the Rhine River in Germany uncovered a burial dating to approximately 14,200 years ago. Inside the grave, carefully arranged and surrounded by grave goods, including carved antler artifacts and traces of red ochre, were the skeletal remains of a man, roughly 40 years old, and a woman, roughly 25 years old. And beside them, interred with the same deliberate care, was a dog. The burial itself was remarkable enough to generate attention from archaeologists across Europe, but the truly significant finding came more than a century later, when veterinary scientist Luc Janssens and a team of researchers reanalyzed the dog's remains using modern veterinary diagnostic techniques and published their results in the Journal of Archaeological Science in 2018. What they found stopped the scientific conversation cold. The Bonn Oberkassel dog had been gravely ill. Detailed analysis of the teeth revealed that the animal had contracted canine distemper virus as a young puppy, around 19 weeks of age. Distemper in canids causes vomiting, diarrhea, respiratory distress, and neurological symptoms including seizures. The disease had ravaged the puppy's developing teeth, leaving a pattern of enamel hypoplasia, visible lines of interrupted growth, that recorded at least 3 distinct episodes of severe illness over a period of several weeks. The puppy survived all 3 episodes, and the only way it could have survived, Janssens concluded, was through sustained, active human care. The disease would have left the animal unable to feed itself, unable to regulate its body temperature, unable to move away from its own waste. Someone had kept this sick puppy warm during Ice Age nights, when temperatures plunged well below freezing. Someone had cleaned it. Someone had fed it by hand when it could not eat on its own. For weeks. During a period of human history when every calorie spent on a dying animal was a calorie stolen from a living human mouth. And when the dog finally died, those same people buried it alongside their own dead in the same grave positioned with the same ritual attention. This was not a working animal being efficiently disposed of after it stopped functioning. This was not a hunting tool being discarded. This was grief. 14,200 years ago, during the final millennia of the Pleistocene, when glaciers still covered northern Europe and survival margins were measured in single meals, a human being loved a dog enough to nurse it through a devastating illness, and then lay it to rest beside the bodies of their own people. Which, looking back, was either incredibly impractical or incredibly revealing about what the relationship between the two species had already become by that point. But the evidence of emotional bonds between humans and canids stretches back even further than the Rhine Valley. In Chauvet Cave, carved into the limestone cliffs of the Ardèche River Gorge in southern France, among some of the oldest cave paintings ever discovered, images of lions and mammoths and woolly rhinoceros rendered with startling artistic sophistication, archaeologists found something on the cave floor that was not art. It was a set of footprints preserved in ancient clay. A child, estimated at roughly 8 to 10 years of age based on foot length, had walked through the deep interior of the cave approximately 26,000 years ago. And beside the child's footprints, walking in the same direction at the same pace, maintaining a consistent distance, were the tracks of a large canid. The tracks are consistent with a child and a large wolf-like animal walking side by side through absolute darkness, deep inside a cave system that could only have been illuminated by the wavering light of a handheld torch. Ichnologists, researchers who specialize in interpreting ancient tracks, confirmed that the canid was not pursuing the child. The animal was accompanying it, walking beside it, 26,000 years ago. Whether that animal was a fully wild wolf, a proto-dog in the early stages of domestication, or something transitional that no modern taxonomy can cleanly classify, remains debated. What is not debated is that a small Paleolithic child and a large carnivore with the jaw strength to crush bone were moving together through a dangerous underground environment with what can only be described as mutual trust. Imagine what it would take for that moment to be possible. Think about how many generations of gradual approach, of shared campfires, of slowly shrinking flight distances, of tentative tolerance hardening into something deeper, had to occur before a child could walk beside a wolf in the dark without either one panicking. Whatever name you give the animal that left those prints in the clay of Chauvet Cave, the relationship was already ancient. And no, I am not making that up. The footprints are preserved in the cave floor and have been studied and published by multiple research teams. If you are wondering what this story has to do with the dog sitting next to you right now, stay with me. The next piece of evidence connects the ancient tracks in that French cave to the biology of the animal in your living room. Alright, so here is where things get genuinely complicated. Because just when the field was beginning to converge on a single coherent narrative, a large-scale ancient DNA study published in 2016 blew the entire model open. Gregor Larsen, an evolutionary biologist at the University of Oxford, and Laurent France, his colleague and a specialist in paleogenomics, assembled the largest ancient DNA dataset ever compiled for the study of dog origins. Their results, published in the journal Science, proposed something that virtually no one in the field had seriously entertained. Dogs were not domesticated once. They were domesticated twice. Larsen and France extracted and sequenced the genome of a 800-year-old dog excavated from Newgrange, the famous Neolithic passage tomb in eastern Ireland, and compared it against genomes from hundreds of modern dogs, sampled from populations spanning Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. The genetic data revealed a pattern that a single origin model could not explain. There appeared to be two distinct ancient dog populations, one in Western Eurasia and one in Eastern Eurasia, whose genetic divergence from each other was too deep to have originated from a single ancestral domestication event. The two lineages looked as though they had split from separate local wolf populations independently. The model proposed that sometime after these two independent domestication events, the eastern dog population migrated westward, carried by human migrations, and partially replaced or interbred with the original western dog lineage. The mixed ancestry visible in modern European dogs was the genetic signature of this ancient replacement event. If this dual origin hypothesis holds up and it remains actively debated, then the domestication of the gray wolf occurred separately, in two different geographic locations, at two different times, carried out by two different groups of humans who had no contact with each other. The same vanishingly unlikely event happened twice. The detail that keeps researchers up at night is the probability. Full domestication of a large, social, pack-hunting carnivore is an extraordinarily rare occurrence in the history of life on Earth. It has happened exactly once. With the wolf. No other large carnivore has ever been domesticated by any human culture. Anywhere, at any time. Not hyenas, not bears, not big cats, not African wild dogs. For this event to have occurred twice, independently, with the same species, suggests that there was something about the gray wolf specifically, about its social structure, its cognitive capabilities, its pack-based decision-making, its willingness to cooperate across species boundaries, that made the partnership not just possible but almost inevitable once the ecological conditions aligned. That is a strange sentence to write about a predator that weighs as much as a grown man and has a bite force exceeding 400 pounds per square inch, roughly 6 times the pressure your jaw generates when you chew a steak. But the genetic evidence is pointing there. Every week, this channel covers another discovery buried in the deep past that mainstream documentaries skip over entirely. If you want to keep seeing this content, hit subscribe right now. The algorithm buries channels that viewers do not actively subscribe to, and the next part of this story is something I have not seen covered anywhere else on this platform. Here is where the timeline stops making comfortable sense. Because the next piece of evidence does not just explain how wolves changed their behavior to become dogs. It reveals what changed inside their cells at the molecular level. And the answer connects to a condition that exists in modern human beings. In 2017, evolutionary geneticist Bridget von Holt at Princeton University published a study in the journal Science Advances that identified specific structural genetic variants present in domestic dogs but absent in gray wolves. The variants were located on chromosome 6, clustered within a region containing genes designated GTF2I and GTF2IRD1. These genes are part of a larger group of roughly 28 genes that, in humans, are associated with a condition known as Williams-Beuren syndrome. Williams-Beuren syndrome in humans is caused by the deletion of approximately 26 to 28 genes from this same chromosomal region. People with the condition exhibit a behavioral profile that is instantly recognizable to clinicians. They are extraordinarily social. They approach total strangers without hesitation. They display intense, sustained interest in other people's faces. They are trusting to a degree that can leave them vulnerable to exploitation. They are gregarious, emotionally expressive, and compulsively friendly. They lack the normal wariness and social caution that neurotypical humans experience around unfamiliar individuals. Von Holt's team discovered that domestic dogs carry structural variants in this same genomic region. The variants do not delete the genes the way the human syndrome does. Instead, they appear to alter gene regulation in ways that produce an analogous behavioral phenotype. Dogs, compared to wolves raised in identical controlled conditions, are dramatically more social toward humans. They seek human attention with significantly greater intensity. They maintain prolonged eye contact with human faces. They approach strangers readily. They display the canine equivalent of the hypersociable behavioral profile documented in Williams-Beuren syndrome. Von Holt tested this directly. Her team measured social behavior in both dogs and wolves that had been raised with equivalent levels of human contact from birth. The dogs with the strongest structural variants in the Williams-Buren chromosomal region spent the most time seeking human contact, maintaining eye gaze, and orienting their bodies toward the nearest person. The wolves, regardless of their socialization history, did not show the same pattern. The difference was not learned. It was genomic. If you are wondering how it is even possible that a genetic region linked to a human behavioral syndrome also shapes the social behavior of an entirely separate species, so is every evolutionary biologist who has read the paper. The implication is staggering. The domestication of the wolf was not just a slow behavioral shift driven by environmental selection for tameness. It was accompanied by, and possibly propelled by, a specific genetic change that fundamentally rewired how the animal processed social information at the neurological level. The wolves that became dogs did not merely learn to tolerate human beings. Something in their DNA mutated so that their descendants became, at the molecular level, compulsively drawn to human contact in a way that their wild ancestors never were and could never be. The dog sitting next to you right now, the one looking at your face, following you from room to room, pressing its skull against your thigh when you sit down, is doing what it does in part because of a structural variant on chromosome 6 in a genomic region that, in your own species, produces a syndrome defined by indiscriminate friendliness and the inability to distrust a stranger's face. The wolf did not merely choose to live with you. Something in its genome changed so that its descendants could not easily choose otherwise. But the transformation was not one-sided. While the wolf was being reshaped into the dog across thousands of generations, the partnership itself was altering the trajectory of human history in ways that are only now becoming visible in the fossil record and the archaeological evidence. In 2015, paleoanthropologist Pat Shipman at Penn State University published a book titled The Invaders that proposed a hypothesis as ambitious as anything in the domestication debate. Shipman argued that the partnership between early, anatomically modern humans and proto-dogs may have been the decisive factor in one of the great extinction events of the Pleistocene, the disappearance of the Neanderthals. For roughly 200,000 to 300,000 years, depending on how you define the lineage, Neanderthals had been the dominant hominin in Europe and Western Asia. They were physically more robust than modern humans. Their brains were as large or larger in absolute volume. They manufactured sophisticated stone tools. They used fire. They buried their dead with apparent ritual intent. Some evidence suggests they may have used spoken language. They had survived multiple glacial cycles and occupied environments, ranging from the Mediterranean coast to the tundra steppe margins of the ice sheets. When anatomically modern humans arrived in Europe from Africa roughly 45,000 years ago, the two species coexisted across the continent for approximately 5,000 to 10,000 years. Then, between 40,000 and 28,000 years ago, the Neanderthals vanished, not in one catastrophic event. In a slow, grinding decline across millennia, their range shrinking, their populations fragmenting, their genetic diversity collapsing, until the last known Neanderthal populations disappeared from their final refugia in southern Iberia and the caves of Gibraltar. Why modern humans survived while Neanderthals, who were equally intelligent and arguably better adapted to European cold, did not, has been debated since the first Neanderthal fossil was recognized in 1856. Shipman's contribution was to point out a correlation that others had overlooked. The timeline of Neanderthal decline overlaps with the earliest evidence of canid-human association in Europe. She proposed that modern humans who formed partnerships with proto-dogs acquired a compound hunting advantage that Neanderthals, who show no archaeological evidence of canid association whatsoever, could not match. A hunting group operating alongside dogs can track wounded prey over far greater distances, following a blood trail through forest or across snow-covered ground that a human nose alone cannot detect. A camp guarded by dogs receives warning of approaching predators or hostile humans far earlier than a camp relying on human sentinels alone. Dogs can be used to drive and herd game toward prepared ambush positions, a hunting strategy that dramatically increases kill rates per pursuit. Each of these advantages is marginal on its own. Together, they compound. And in an environment where two competing hominin species were exploiting the same shrinking prey base during a period of severe climate deterioration, marginal advantages accumulate into existential ones over centuries. Shipman was careful throughout the book to present her hypothesis as a plausible model, not a proven fact. The evidence is circumstantial. The dating of the earliest wolf-human associations is imprecise. The relationship between early modern humans and the canids at the edges of their camps may not have been structured enough at that stage to function as a coordinated hunting partnership in the way modern human dog hunting teams operate. But the possibility remains, and it is a haunting one. The animal that walked beside a Paleolithic child through the darkness of Chauvet Cave 26,000 years ago may not have been just a companion. It may have been a strategic asset, a biological surveillance system, a competitive advantage that tipped the balance between two intelligent, tool-using, fire-wielding primate species sharing the same continent, and contributed to sending one of them into permanent extinction. If you want to see a full documentary on what we now know about what really happened to the Neanderthals and why they disappeared so completely from a world they had occupied for 250,000 years, that video is coming to this channel soon. Subscribe now so you do not miss it. The algorithm does not surface videos from channels you are not subscribed to, and this is exactly the kind of content that gets buried without active engagement. The question that opened this story was framed as a binary. Did wolves choose to live with us, or did we steal their pups? The evidence, accumulated across 25 years of ancient DNA sequencing, morphological analysis, behavioral experimentation in Siberian research facilities, comparative cognitive testing at Duke University in Princeton, and meticulous archaeological excavation from Belgian limestone caves to German river valleys to French underground galleries, points to an answer that is neither. The wolves did not choose us, not in the way we use the word choice. They responded to an environmental gradient, a selection pressure that favored individuals with reduced fear responses, that rewarded proximity to human camps with reliable access to calories, that selected for the genetic variants that made certain wolves slightly more tolerant of human noise, slightly more curious about human activity, slightly more willing to linger at the edge of the firelight instead of fading back into the frozen darkness of the Ice Age steppe. Those wolves were not making a conscious decision to join human society. They were surviving. They were doing what evolution rewards. They were following the food. And the humans did not steal their pups, not at the beginning, not in the way the old textbooks described. The traditional kidnapping narrative assumes a level of intentionality, planning, and sustained effort that Paleolithic nomadic bands almost certainly did not possess and could not have maintained across the generations required to produce meaningful genetic change. The relationship did not begin with capture and force. It began with tolerance and proximity, with two wary species occupying the same landscape, gradually discovering that the presence of the other was not a threat, but an advantage. What actually happened was something far stranger and far more consequential than either origin story suggests. Two species, each shaped by tens of millions of years of independent evolution, drifted into each other's ecological orbit during the harshest climatic period of the last 100,000 years of Earth's history. The wolves that approached human camps survived because human waste and abandoned kill sites provided calories. The humans who tolerated those wolves nearby survived because the wolves provided early detection of approaching predators, competing carnivores, and possibly hostile human groups. Each species, by tolerating the proximity of the other, gained an edge that neither possessed alone. Over hundreds of generations, across thousands of years, the tolerance deepened into something that resembled dependence. The wolves at the edge of the camp became tamer. The tamest bred with other tame individuals. Genetic changes in the Williams-Buren region of chromosome 6 amplified social behavior toward humans to a degree that no wild wolf would naturally display. Physical changes followed as inevitable developmental byproducts: the floppy ears, the shortened muzzles, the spotted coats, the curled tails, all consequences of the same neural crest cell pathway alterations that Belyaev's team documented in their silver foxes at Novosibirsk half a century ago. The wolf became something new. It was no longer a wolf, and it was not yet the dogs we know today, but a creature caught in between, genetically rewired for partnership with another species in a way that no mammal had ever been wired before. The humans changed too. Populations that incorporated proto-dogs into their hunting strategies, their camp security systems, and eventually their emotional and social lives outperformed populations that did not. The partnership may have given anatomically modern humans the compound advantage they needed to outlast the Neanderthals across a shrinking Ice Age ecosystem, where every marginal gain in hunting efficiency and every incremental improvement in predator detection translated into survival. Dogs became embedded in human burial practices, appearing in graves alongside human remains at least 200 years ago. They became part of human mythology across every continent. They became part of human emotional architecture in a way that no other domesticated animal, not horses, not cats, not cattle, has ever replicated. The relationship was not theft. It was not a conscious choice by either party. It was coevolution, a word that sounds clinical and dry until you sit with what it actually means. Two species, each one acting in its own survival interest, gradually reshaping each other's genomes, each one becoming something that could not exist in its current form without the other. The wolf could not have become the dog without the sustained proximity of human camps. The human may not have become the globally dominant species without the hunting, guarding, and social advantages the proto-dog provided during the critical millennia of the late Pleistocene. Every week on this channel, there is another discovery buried in the archaeological and genetic record that changes how we understand the deep history of life on this planet. If this kind of content is what you come to this platform for, let me know in the comments which part of this story you found most surprising, or which angle you want explored in a future video. I read every comment, and the best responses help shape what gets covered next. The real question at the heart of all this evidence is not whether wolves chose us or we chose them. It is whether, 40,000 years later, we have even begun to understand what the partnership truly cost both sides and what it truly gave. Because the wolf at the edge of that Paleolithic campfire, the one whose descendants would one day carry a mutation on chromosome 6 that made them neurologically incapable of ignoring a human face, did not know what it was giving up. It did not know that its pack structure, its hunting independence, its capacity to survive alone in the wild without human support would be traded away generation by generation for scraps and shelter and the neurological compulsion to gaze into the eyes of a species that had not even invented agriculture yet. And the human sitting by that fire, tossing a cracked marrow bone into the darkness where a pair of amber eyes caught the light, did not know that the animal creeping closer was about to become the most consequential biological partnership in the history of mammals. A partnership not recorded in any treaty or agreement, not negotiated by any council, not planned by any mind on either side of the equation. A partnership written in the DNA of both species, permanently and irreversibly. The footprints in Chauvet Cave are still there, preserved in clay that has not been disturbed in 26,000 years. A child and a canid, walking together through the dark, deep inside a mountain by the light of a single torch. Neither one understanding where the path would lead, neither one knowing that they were walking into a future that neither species could undo. If you want to see what else is buried in the deep past that mainstream history courses do not cover, click the video on the screen now.